From BNC Radio and the Montgomery Blair High School English Department, this is a Living Languages presentation. Today, we'll be talking about irony. When we think about satire, it's very important that we understand irony. All satire contains irony. So, what is irony anyways? Well, unfortunately, it gets complicated. We do have a pretty good, simple definition of irony. We can say that irony is how we highlight some sort of difference between expectations and reality. But of course, it isn't that simple. There is one thing that we can start with though, and that is that irony is often unexpected. The problem with irony is that it's really subjective. That means that everyone has a slightly different idea of irony based on what they're familiar with, how they've grown up, what they like to read, what sort of music they like to listen to, even who they follow on Twitter. These sorts of things all affect how a person defines the word ironic. The complicatedness of the subject doesn't stop here either. Because, remember, irony deals with the unexpected. Since everyone comes into a situation with different expectations, everyone finds different things unexpected. To some people, expectations and reality might be the same thing. To others, expectations and reality don't quite line up. People don't always agree on what's ironic because in any given situation, different people find different things unexpected. Now, that being said, let's take a look at a famous example of irony from Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. The Texan turned out to be good-natured, generous, and likable. In 3 days, no one could stand him. So, why is this quote ironic? Let's break it down. The first sentence talks about how nice this character is. It describes him as a good-natured, generous, and even likable man. These are traits that most people would like. If someone's good-natured, generous, and likable, then someone would generally want to be around that person. The second sentence states that, in a short period of time, everyone hates this nice man. This passage is ironic because you don't expect everyone to hate the Texan. But again, irony isn't that simple, because there's more than one type of irony. There's verbal irony, dramatic irony, and situational irony. We'll start by talking about situational irony, since we just gave an example of it. When something happens and a reversal of expectations occurs, that's situational irony. Remember, the key here is the reversal. Let's look at that passage about the Texan. Why is that an example of situational irony? The first sentence is the setup. It creates an expectation. The expectation is that since he's generous, good-natured, and likable, people will like him. The second sentence is the reversal. In that sentence, we find that in 3 days, no one could stand him. That isn't what we thought would happen. We thought that people would like him. But thanks to the reversal in the second sentence, we have situational irony. Let's look now at a different type of irony from our list, dramatic irony. To look at dramatic irony, we'll again use a very famous example. This time, we'll be going back a little further in time to look at Romeo and Juliet. First, though, let's define dramatic irony. Dramatic irony occurs when an event happens, and the audience understands the importance of that event, but the characters don't. Let's look at an example. Perhaps the most famous example of dramatic irony in English literature, the end of Romeo and Juliet. In case you haven't read Shakespeare recently, here's a refresher. Basically, Romeo and Juliet are in love. They hatch this crazy plan to get away from their fighting families. This plan involves Juliet faking her own death with an intense sleeping potion. But they decide to change the plan at the last second. Well, Romeo tries to change the plan. Juliet doesn't exactly find out. So when Romeo goes to meet Juliet, he thinks she's dead. She's really just asleep. The audience knows that, but Romeo doesn't. Let's watch that part now.
Here will I remain, with worms that are thy chambermaids, oh God. Eyes, look your last. Arms, take your last embrace. And lips, owe you the dawns of breath, seal with a righteous kiss a dateless bargain to engrossing death. Here's to my love. Thus, with a kiss, I die.
So, hold up, what happened here? Romeo just killed himself. That's what happened. He thought that Juliet was dead, so he decided that he wanted to die too. In fact, we know that she's just asleep. Shakespeare sets it up that way. Why, you ask? Because he's a fan of dramatic irony. So then, things escalate even more. Let's finish the scene.
What's here? Poison, I see, hath been his timeless end. Oh, Cher, drunk all and left no friendly drop to help me after. I will kiss thy lips. Haply some poison yet doth hang on them to make me die with a restorative. Thy lips are warm. No! Then I'll be brief. Oh, happy dagger. This is thy sheath. There rust and let me die.
Juliet wakes up, the audience knew she would. And she doesn't know that Romeo's dead. Again, the audience does. That's dramatic irony. And when she finds out, you guessed it, she kills herself too. With irony, you have to ask a very important question. Why did the author choose to use it? Think about that and keep it in mind. We'll be there in about 2 minutes. Let's move on now to our third and final type of irony for today's lesson, verbal irony. Verbal irony is simply when someone says something but means something else. That's it. Is it that simple? Of course not. There are a lot of debates among English scholars about whether or not sarcasm counts as verbal irony. We know one thing for sure. Just because it's verbal irony doesn't mean it's sarcasm. Some people say that all sarcasm is verbal irony. Others say that only some sarcasm counts as verbal irony. And others say that no sarcasm counts as verbal irony. It's really hard, and we're not going to spend any more time on that debate. Like irony in general, figuring that part out is really subjective. It depends on who you ask. Anyways, let's look at our third and final example, our example for verbal irony. To do that, we go back to Catch-22. In this scene, Clevenger is on trial. It's pretty clear that he isn't being tried for anything in particular, which is one of the things that Joseph Heller is getting at in this scene. However, at one point, Clevenger is accused of saying that there was no way the officers could punish him. Clevenger denies that accusation, saying that he never said any such thing. This makes Colonel Cathcart very angry. An absurd exchange follows. That's our example of verbal irony. Let's look at that part now. "I didn't say you couldn't punish me, sir." "When?" asked the colonel. "When what, sir?" "Now you're asking me questions again." "I'm sorry, sir. I'm afraid I don't understand your question." "When didn't you say we couldn't punish you? Don't you understand my question?" "No, sir. I don't understand." "You've just told us that. Now suppose you answer my question." "But how can I answer it?" "That's another question you're asking me." "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't know how to answer it. I never said you couldn't punish me." "Now you're telling us when you did say it. I'm asking you to tell us when you didn't say it." Clevenger took a deep breath. "I always didn't say you couldn't punish me, sir." Now, this is a great example of verbal irony. Why? All Clevenger wants to do is tell Colonel Cathcart that he never said anything like what he's being accused of saying. Due to the absurdness of the system that he's working in, he has to come up with this screwed up statement that could be so much simpler. He doesn't mean to say what he ends up saying. Thus, we have a great example of verbal irony. Let's go back to the other question we posed at the end of the Romeo and Juliet analysis. Why does the author use irony in satire? Why is it so important? Remember that satire is used to point at a particular vice or folly. In simpler terms, people use satire to point out a problem they have with some aspect of society. Maybe it's something they think is hurtful, which we call a vice. Maybe it's just something they think is silly or annoying. We call that a folly. So, how does this scene with Clevenger attack a vice or folly? In this case, Joseph Heller is pointing to what he believes is the inefficient system in place that controls our military. In the case of Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare is pointing at a folly, impulsive teenage love. Romeo and Juliet are each about 14 years old. They've just made huge, impulsive, stupid decisions. Maybe a double suicide is more rare, but Shakespeare is pointing to how impulsive we are, and what the consequences might be. As for the Texan, well, it depends on how you look at it. Some people might say that Joseph Heller is making fun of optimists, people who look at everything in a more happy, positive way, while other people might say that Heller is making fun of pessimism, when people look at things in a more depressed, apathetic, or negative way. Either way, the Texan is a good example of situational irony. We hope that you've learned a lot about the different types of irony. Remember, irony is really hard. It's really hard. It took this long to explain it, and you might still not get it. If that's the case, never hesitate to talk it out with an English teacher. It always makes for an interesting conversation.
B&C Radio.